Do you ever find yourself sitting in the absolute silence of a Sunday afternoon, surrounded by everything you ever worked for? A beautiful home, a loving family, a career that looks perfect from the outside. And yet, your chest feels like it's being crushed by an invisible weight. Your heart is racing, your stomach is tight, and you are gripped by a sudden, irrational terror that you can't name. You tell yourself, I have no reason to be anxious. But your nervous system is screaming that you are in danger. What if I told you that your perfectionism isn't a badge of honor? What if your drive to be the perfect partner, the perfect parent, and the perfect professional is actually a survival algorithm? A trauma response your brain learned long before you were an adult. In the next few minutes, we are going to dismantle the mask you've been wearing for decades. We will explore why your body is fighting a war you didn't even know existed, and how to reclaim your life from the ghost of your past. Are you ready to see what is hiding behind your perfection? Let's dive in. Meet Sarah, a 42-year-old marketing executive and mother of two who seems to have it all together. Every day, her life operates like a flawless machine. Her house is spotless, her emails are answered within minutes, and she is the designated crisis solver for everyone around her. She calls this exhausting rhythm discipline. She calls it having high standards. But beneath that polished persona, her social battery is completely drained. Consider a typical Thursday evening. Sarah is utterly exhausted, a migraine splitting her head, and she just wants to close her eyes. Suddenly, her phone buzzed, a message from a friend asking for a huge favor this weekend, or perhaps her partner asking her to handle an errand she simply has no capacity for. Instantly, her chest tightens, her inner voice screams, "No, I cannot do this." But before her rational brain can even formulate a boundary, her fingers are already flying across the screen, typing, "Of course, no problem at all," with a smiley face. The exact second she hits send, a suffocating wave of resentment crashes over her. She feels a bitter anger toward them for asking, but more profoundly, she hates herself for self-abandoning yet again. Why does she do this? Why does she constantly volunteer for her own exploitation? Society applauds this behavior as selfless dedication. But clinical psychology reveals a far more sinister reality. Sarah is not making a conscious choice to be kind. Her nervous system is being hijacked. In neurobiology, this is known as the fawn response, the lesser-known sibling of fight, flight, and freeze. When Sarah's phone buzzed, her amygdala didn't perceive a simple request. It registered a literal threat to her survival. For someone trapped in this cycle, the mere thought of disappointing another human being equates to the primal terror of being abandoned. Her body bypasses logic entirely and instantly appeases the perceived threat to buy back safety. That relentlessly spotless kitchen, that inability to sit still on the sofa for more than 10 minutes without feeling guilty, that isn't high standards, it is hyper-vigilance. Her nervous system is locked in a state of chronic threat simulation, constantly scanning the environment for the slightest micro-expression of dissatisfaction. If someone sighs in the next room, her adrenaline spikes, and she rushes to fix an emotional problem that isn't even hers. She has convinced herself that this endless giving is pure love and moral altruism. But beneath the mask of the perfect savior, it is an unconscious transaction. She is desperately purchasing her right to exist by paying with her own psychological energy. She secretly believes that if she ever stops being relentlessly useful, the world will realize she is an imposter and leave her behind. This is the silent tragedy of the domestic martyr. You build a beautiful golden cage out of your own sacrifices, and then you quietly resent the very people you chose to serve. But the human body can only sustain this immense psychological debt for so long, before the repressed shadow inevitably demands to collect its dues. Then one day, the fragile architecture of Sarah's coping mechanism finally fractured. It was a Sunday evening. She had spent the entire weekend cooking, cleaning, and emotionally managing her family's moods while utterly ignoring her own exhaustion. The dinner was finished. Her husband and children had retreated to the living room to watch a movie, and the house was finally quiet. Sarah walked into the kitchen to turn off the lights, and there it was, a single unrinsed spoon left carelessly on the pristine marble counter. It was just a spoon, but to Sarah's overloaded nervous system, it was a profound declaration of disrespect. Something inside her snapped. The micro-eruption was violent and immediate, she yelled. She lashed out with a stinging, sarcastic remark about how she was the only one who cared about this house, leaving her family staring at her in stunned silence. The air in the room froze, but the explosion did not bring relief. It brought a crushing wave of guilt. 10 minutes later, Sarah stood alone at the kitchen sink, scrubbing it so hard her knuckles turned white, while hot tears streamed down her face. Her stomach was tied in agonizing knots. The guilt spiral pulled her under. She ruthlessly condemned herself. I am so toxic. I am a terrible mother. I ruined a perfectly good Sunday over a piece of silverware. She promised herself she would read more self-help books, meditate, and be more patient. She diagnosed her outburst as a character flaw, an ugly disease she needed to cure. But what if she was entirely wrong? What if this anger was not a disease at all? Let us look through the lens of modern neurobiology. When we examine the polyvagal theory and the function of the amygdala, a radical truth emerges. Sarah's outburst was not a loss of control. It was her biological bodyguard finally breaking down the door. For years, her nervous system had been stuck in the fawn response, systematically suppressing her legitimate needs to keep everyone else comfortable. Her vagus nerve had been forced to repeatedly mute her distress signals. But anger is the evolutionary guardian of our boundaries. When you self-abandon for too long, your primal brain eventually realizes that your psychological survival is at stake. The anger she felt wasn't about the spoon. It was the desperate, healthy scream of her inner architecture trying to protect her from total erasure. Society conditions us to suppress this anger, to label it as unladylike or undisciplined. But biologically, this rage is the most authentic, life-preserving mechanism she possesses. It is the alarm bell indicating that she is bleeding out energetically. And here's the ultimate tragedy. By immediately spiraling into guilt, by rushing to apologize and overcompensating, by cleaning more, Sarah is actively assassinating her only protector. She uses guilt to force the bodyguard back into the basement. Every time you apologize for the anger that arises from being exploited, you're telling your nervous system that your boundaries do not matter. You're reinforcing the trauma loop. You're not a bad person for snapping. Your body is simply fighting a war against the invisible cage you built. It is begging you to finally listen. Because of that crushing realization, Sarah found herself hiding in the one place she felt truly safe. It was the middle of a chaotic Saturday afternoon, and the house was buzzing with family. The noise, the demands, the sheer volume of stimuli felt like physical blows to her skull. So she quietly slipped away, walked into the bathroom, locked the door, flipped down the toilet lid, and just sat there. She stared blankly at her phone screen, doom-scrolling without reading a single word, while the bathroom fan hummed above her. Suddenly, she heard a heavy footstep outside the door, followed by a voice calling out for her. Her heart instantly hammered against her ribs, and she literally held her breath, praying they would think the room was empty. Sitting there in the dim light, a profound wave of grief washed over her. She asked herself the most agonizing question: why do I feel the desperate need to escape the very family I love more than anything? To understand this tragic paradox, we have to travel back in time, back to the foundation of her nervous system. Sarah was not born a perfectionist. She was forged into one. As a young girl, she unconsciously became the emotional thermostat of her household. Perhaps she grew up around unpredictable anger, emotional unavailability, or incredibly high expectations where love was treated as a conditional reward. To survive the terrifying threat of being unwanted, the little girl learned to tiptoe. She became the invisible achiever, the child who caused no problems, anticipated every adult's mood, and magically fixed things before they broke. Her nervous system wrote a permanent code. I am only safe if I am useful, and I will be abandoned if I am a burden. This brings us to the brilliant, piercing truth of Carl Jung's psychology. Jung taught us that we all wear a mask, a persona to navigate the world. For Sarah, this persona was the selfless martyr, the flawless mother, the ultimate problem solver. She genuinely believed her relentless self-sacrifice was a sign of moral altruism and profound love. But it was an illusion. The painful truth is that her chronic people-pleasing was actually a covert, trauma-driven transaction. She was desperately buying security with her own soul, and everything she suppressed to maintain that perfect image, her exhaustion, her legitimate anger, her fundamental human right to just rest, did not magically disappear. It was banished to the dark basement of her psyche. What Jung called the shadow, and the shadow never stays buried forever. That suffocating resentment she felt when saying yes to her friend, that micro-eruption over the dirty spoon, that pathetic need to hide in a locked bathroom just to breathe. That was her shadow leaking out, begging to be integrated. Because of this terrifying epiphany, the entire architecture of her life began to shake. She finally saw that her goodness was a shield forged from childhood terror. And until finally, Sarah realized that her silent endurance was not protecting her family at all, it was actively poisoning them. This is where the science of epigenetics delivers its most devastating cognitive slap. Research shows that when you swallow your boundaries and force a smile while your nervous system is in a state of chronic alarm, you're not just hurting yourself, you are fundamentally altering the chemical expression of your own DNA. You're writing a biological manual on how to live in fear and passing that exact manual down to your children. Sarah looked at her young daughter and experienced a horrifying epiphany. By playing the perfect self-sacrificing martyr, she was not teaching her daughter about unconditional love. She was modeling that a woman's worth is strictly measured by how much she can suffer for others. She was not being a saint. She was an unconscious, toxic enabler of a generational curse. To break this deeply ingrained neural loop, Sarah had to embrace a terrifying new paradigm. She had to accept the villain prescription. For the chronic people pleaser, setting a boundary feels like committing a moral crime. But becoming the villain in someone else's story is the only known cure for the fawning response. It means allowing that sink to overflow with dirty dishes and simply walking away to sleep. It means looking at a friend's demanding text message, feeling the familiar tightening in your chest, and choosing to type, "No, I cannot do that today," without offering a single excuse. The first time Sarah applied this prescription, her body went into absolute shock. She retreated to her room, her hands shaking, her breath shallow. But then, the true reflection began. A profound, crushing grief washed over her, a delayed mourning for the invisible little girl who had to completely abandon herself just to survive her childhood. She wrapped her arms around her own chest, feeling the frantic beating of her heart, and whispered to her inner child, "I'm so sorry I made you work so hard just to be loved." As the tears fell, she finally stopped fighting her shadow. She allowed herself to be perceived by others as selfish, as lazy, as inconsiderate. She let the mask of the good girl shatter completely. And as she sat there in the dim light, actively choosing not to fix her husband's mild annoyance or manage her children's minor frustrations, a biological miracle occurred. The frantic threat simulation in her amygdala began to quiet down. Her vagus nerve finally recognized the safety of the present moment. The world did not literally end because she chose herself. The roof did not cave in. For the first time in 42 years, she sat perfectly still in the quiet darkness, feeling guilty, yes, but beneath that guilt was an undeniable, rock-solid peace. She was no longer the emotional thermostat of the house. She had become the ultimate cycle breaker. You are not broken, and you never were. The crushing exhaustion, the relentless guilt, the desperate need to keep everyone happy at the cost of your own sanity. It was never a character flaw. It was just a brilliant biological survival algorithm that simply outlived its usefulness. True liberation does not start when the people around you finally decide to respect your boundaries. It starts entirely from within. It starts the exact moment you can sit in the suffocating discomfort of their disappointment and realize that your world is not going to end. You have the ultimate power to become the alchemist of your own psychological shadow, transforming your deeply repressed anger into the very steel that protects your inner peace, by allowing the fragile mask of the perfect domestic martyr to finally fall. You're doing something magnificent. You are actively rewriting the epigenetic code of your entire family line. You are the barrier, the brave cycle breaker who ensures the trauma algorithm permanently stops with you. If you saw your own painful reflection in Sarah's story today, if you're finally ready to stop being the emotional thermostat for everyone else, save this message. Remind your terrified nervous system that it is finally safe to just be an imperfect human. But putting down the heavy burden of perfection is only the beginning of a much deeper, darker descent. Because what happens when you have worn the mask of the relentless savior for so long that you no longer recognize the face underneath it? What happens when the invincible persona you constructed to survive your 30s suddenly triggers a complete, uncontrollable nervous system collapse the moment you turn 40? The shedding of the social mask is not a gentle, peaceful process. It is a violent ego death. The true dark night of the soul is waiting in the shadows, and we will dissect that terrifying, beautiful unraveling in our very next chapter.